Good morning, and thank you for having me back again to speak on Remembrance Day. For those of you who don't know, I take a Remembrance Day message into the secondary schools and some of the senior public schools in and around Lindsay every year, and I try to have a bit of a theme to those discussions. And this year's theme was morality and conflict. And can we maintain peacetime values in a time of war? Or is that a luxury that we can't afford? And so I chose a story this year to kind of highlight some of the difficulties and some of the moral issues that come up in that type of setting. I just wanted to put up a slide there. It didn't quite copy over very well, but if you take a look at the third row down where it says casualties in World War I, World War II, Korea, the Gulf, and Afghanistan, you can see some of the amazing sacrifices that have been made in the name of our country and in the name of freedom. And in particularly World War I and World War II, where combined Canada sacrificed over 100,000 lives in the name of our country. And we're going to speak a little bit about some of those casualties in World War II, and about a quarter of them, 10,000 of them, all occurred in one setting. And to do that, we're just going to do a really quick, brief history lesson. For some of you, this will just be a review. But in 1939, when the war started, it began in an easterly direction with Germany's invasion of Poland and annexation of Austria. And in pretty short order, and I know I'm skipping over a lot of details here, the war came to the west. France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and most of the Commonwealth had declared war on Germany. But because of the changing nature of war, the Allies were very quickly overwhelmed and had to famously evacuate through Dunkirk and did not have a presence in mainland Europe for a number of years. And as hard as it is for us to consider today, Russia was an ally during the Second World War. And as Germany pushed east with its invasion of Russia, there was considerable pressure on the remaining allies to open a second front in Western Europe to relieve some of that pressure on the Russians in the east. And it wouldn't be until 1944 that was able to happen. But in the interim, because the Allies were nowhere close after Dunkirk to being able to mount an amphibious invasion in Europe, they had to look at a different solution. And that solution was the problem was, how do we open a second front in the West? And the solution was something called Bomber Command. And air power was just kind of coming into its own in the Second World War. That's a Lancaster, one of the few remaining in flying condition. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But in the beginning, Bomber Command had a really big dilemma. And that dilemma was that they were more of a blunt instrument as opposed to a surgical tool. And by that I mean it was very difficult for them to hit a single target. And the Allies' analysis was that only 1 in 10 bombs fell even within a 5-mile radius of their intended target. To go along with that, you can see on the image on the right there, the odds of surviving a tour in Bomber Command were very slim. About 1 in 4 would make it through a 30-mission tour, and that was in 1944. Earlier in the war, the odds were probably about 1 in 6. So you had these incredibly courageous air crew going out night after night, and many of them not returning. And so, and then to compound that, if you were sending them out to hit a small target that they really had very little chance of hitting reliably, you really had to question that loss of life. So the solution was something that they called the area bombing campaign. And the area bombing campaign meant that instead of trying to strike a small target, they would attack an entire city. And by doing so, they would accomplish a number of things. They would prevent the German defenses from focusing on a small area, and they would provide themselves with a better opportunity of surviving, but also of hitting their target. But bombing a city meant deliberately targeting civilians and not just military targets. And so that was what came to be very controversial about the campaign. But you can see that what the goal was to eliminate Germany's ability to wage war by attacking their industrial capability, to move defenses from the Eastern Front, to shatter the morale of German civilians, and the overall objectives was to create an environment that would bring about a quicker end to the war with fewer overall loss of life. So even back at the time, it was controversial, but as history went on, two things became apparent. One, the area bombing campaign was very effective in bringing about an end to the war, and two, its controversy only grew. The other really tremendous thing about what happened with Bomber Command was how it transitioned and how it transformed itself over the course of the war. And there's a really great saying in leadership circles that true transformation only occurs in two settings. And one is at the hands of an exceptional transformational leader, and the other is in times of crisis. Well, this was certainly in times of crisis. And I've listed a number of things that really helped to transform Bomber Command from that blunt instrument into a surgical tool. Radar and the targeting system that they called OVO really revolutionized that technology. In 1942, Bomber Command scraped together just about every plane that could fly, and they sent them all out in a single raid against the city of Cologne. And it was called one of the most boldest moves of the war, and if it had failed, the effects would have been devastating. But it was a tremendous success, unless you were in Cologne that night, and it basically reduced much of the town to rubble. The Pathfinder squadrons were squadrons that were sent in ahead of the main bomber waves to mark the targets, and then that was another revolutionary development that occurred during the war. The Lancaster, as we mentioned, came into service in 42, and by the end of the war was the backbone of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force. And I think I failed to mention earlier, but one of the reasons that this is so important from a Canadian perspective is that Canada provided 1/3 of the total air crew in Bomber Command, which is an incredible accomplishment for a country of our size. Late in the war, the American P-51 Mustang came into service and was able to provide air cover for the bomber crews all the way into Germany, which previously had not been available, and again really demonstrate or really change the balance of power in the air. And then finally, I put down a couple of individual things that demonstrate how far Bomber Command had come during the war. And the Tirpitz, for those that don't know, was the sister ship to the Bismarck. And after the Bismarck was sunk, the Tirpitz was kind of sequestered away up near Norway to try and keep it safe. And the Allies targeted it, and at that point, we're now able to target and deliver bombs on a target as small as a ship. So really tremendous accomplishment. And then, of course, the Dam Busters, the famous story again, some of the revolutionary tactics that were developed. So while that was all occurring, the area bombing campaign continued. And some of the, and I think this is important to talk about as we look back at history. And some of the important events that occurred was in 1943, the Bomber Command sent a huge attack on the city of Hamburg, and sort of by accident they discovered that by dropping a combination of incendiary bombs with high explosives, they created what was called a firestorm, and it was more effective than anybody could have imagined, but it also resulted in the loss of 40,000 civilian lives. And to be fair, area bombing wasn't one-sided. London and many other British cities were subjected to similar treatment, but as the balance of power in the air tipped decidedly in favor of the Allies, Germany resorted to other tactics, and they developed, you can see the V1 bomb in the lower left and the V2 rocket in the upper left. And in the center there, you see that large concrete structure. It was a V2 factory, and the walls on that were about 10 feet thick to show you how important that program was to Germany. So there were atrocities occurring on both sides, for sure. But one of the most controversial ones occurred at the end of the war in the city of Dresden. And by this time, again, Bomber Command had demonstrated that they could hit very small targets very reliably. The war was nearing an end, and a decision was made to attack the city of Dresden, which had, to that point, been largely spared from the carnage of war. And the firebombing campaign by both Bomber Command and American bombers, again, had devastating effect. 20,000 lives were lost. And that event, at that point, many of those in political and military circles who had supported the area bombing campaign earlier now began to distance themselves from Bomber Command. And this is one of the real tragedies, I think, of what happened at the end of the war, was those bomber crews that had served so faithfully and paid such a high cost in terms of their own lives were denied any sort of recognition at the end of the war. In a lot of ways, Dresden was more controversial than the use of the atomic bomb in Japan. That's the Dam Busters Memorial in a small town in central England. You can see the image on the left. It's built to represent the dam that the Dam Busters attacked, and that squadron was also the squadron that carried out the successful attack on the Tirpitz. So it took 70 years for Bomber Command to receive any official recognition. And it was in 2017 that the International Bomber Command Center was opened in England. And you can see the tall spire in the center there. Is the height of that is the wingspan, is the exact wingspan of a Lancaster bomber. And you can see the three sort of guiding focus of the Bomber Command Center: remembrance, recognition, and reconciliation. And it's a very powerful site. All around that spire in the center are these steel plaques with names of those who died in service of Bomber Command. And as I have a tendency to do, I usually walk around and look for my surname on some of these monuments, and I counted over 100 names of just Mitchell alone, over 100 who died in service during the Second World War. And that's a flying Lancaster at the Aviation Museum in Hamilton. And I think this is a really great story as we talk about the horrors of war and about what can occur afterwards. And you can see here that after the war, the city of Dresden and the English city of Coventry became twin cities, joined to reconcile and remember what had happened to both sides during the war. And I would be remiss if I didn't close with a mention that this year is the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, of the so-called Great War. And one of the great traditions that have flowed from the end of World War I is the playing of the last post at Menon's Gate in the Belgium city of Ypres. And you can see the stone tablets that surround the interior and exterior of that structure, with the names of all those who were killed in the war and have no known resting place. The Canadian Memorial at Vimy Ridge, which also has over 11,000 names of Canadian soldiers with no known resting place. And a smaller, more subtle monument was what we had in Kandahar, Afghanistan. during my time there, and there were 29 names added to that memorial during my tour. I think a wonderful thing that we're doing this year is the Bells of Peace initiative, where churches and other agencies are invited to ring the bell at the going down of the sun on November 11th, 100 times, in recognition of the end of the Great War. And we will be participating in that. And the image there is taken from a famous monument in a town called St. Julien, where chlorine and mustard gas was used for the first time in the First World War, and it was Canadian troops that bore the brunt of that assault and held the line when army or forces on both sides of them fell back, and it was the Canadians that held their ground. So, tremendous testament to our men and women who have served, who have sacrificed, and who continue to serve. Thank you very much.